When I say McLaren, what's the first thought that comes to your mind? A successful F1 team? A sports car manufacturer? A big-ass factory with its own lake? Or a man who built himself up from nothing to have one of the biggest legacies in motorsport history. Today, we're going to be concentrating on said man, and we will also commemorate the 50 years of his passing with a little extra help from a guy you probably know. Bruce McLaren was born in August 30th, 1937 in Auckland, New Zealand, and was unfortunately diagnosed with a rare condition that affects approximately 1 in every 9,000 children. But neither now nor back in 1946 was the origin known, when 9-year-old Bruce McLaren was diagnosed with it. It deteriorates the femoral head, and as a result of this he had a very characteristic limp, due to one leg being shorter than the other. From a very young age he was a very hands-on kid, and liked spending time at his parents' workshop, therefore becoming very familiar and comfortable with cars and their innards from a very young age. At 14 years old, Bruce entered a hill climb with an Austin 7 Ulster, restored by his father. From then on he got the racing bug, and moved up to a 410 Special 2 years later, then an Austin Haley, and ended up with an F2 Cooper Climax, which he modified and mastered to take second in the 1957 New Zealand Championship Series. In '58 he took part in the International New Zealand Grand Prix, where he was noticed by Jack Brabham, who took him under his wing and pushed for him to be selected under the Driver to Europe program, an initiative by the New Zealand International Grand Prix organization to give young drivers a chance at driving in Europe, in this case with the Cooper team, an opportunity he would have been daft not to take. When he got to England, he was taken to the Cooper factory and was given the materials necessary to make his own F2 car. Yes, you heard that right. After the long trip and all, he was given a toolbox and a bunch of materials for him to make his own car, which he then entered to a race at the 1958 German Grand Prix and a belt head at the Nordschleife in the Nürburgring. It was a combined F1 and F2 race, where he would start negotiating his way through all the other F2 cars, getting in the lead, and then start scrambling with the F1 drivers to finish 5th overall and 1st in his category. He went against drivers like Stirling Moss and Mike Hawthorne that day. This was a huge boost for him, and this is where he started getting noticed internationally. McLaren would get a seat at the Cooper team for 1959, his first Formula 1 season, alongside his mate, mentor and idol Jack Brabham. The year started off with a win for Brabham at the Monaco Grand Prix, with another one a few races later in Great Britain, where Bruce took his first podium with a close third, just 2 tenths behind Stirling Moss in the BRM. For that year's US Grand Prix, the track would be Sebring for the first and last time in the F1 calendar. The historic and honestly really fun to drive track that the Kiwi dominated, giving him and New Zealand their first Formula 1 win, and crowning him the youngest ever race winner, a record that stood for 44 years until Hungary 2003. For 1960, the Cooper was a dominating machine, and Bruce took the win at the opening round in Argentina, and finished on the podium 5 further times, while his teammate took the championship with a dominating 5 wins. 1961 was a quieter year. The team was falling from grace and finished second behind Ferrari and with only 1 podium and a ton of reliability issues. Brabham would leave by the end of the season with hopes of starting his own team, an idea that Bruce was very fond of. Later that year, he'd meet a very special girl at a party and ended up marrying Patty a few months later. In 1962, he'd win the Monaco Grand Prix, but by the end of '63, it was clear that the team and the car weren't competitive anymore. Understandably, he wanted out. For 1964, he'd start building his own car, and as it was common at the time, he bought the chassis from Cooper and modified it to his own specification to compete on the Tasman series. He won on his first appearance in the Cooper McLaren at the New Zealand Grand Prix alongside Teddy Mayer's brother, Timmy, who unfortunately passed away later that year while practicing at the Longford circuit. In his eulogy, Bruce wrote the words that still accompany most F1 fans until today. The news that he had died instantly was a terrible shock to us all, but who is it to say that he had not seen more, done more, and learned more in his few years than many people do in a lifetime? It would be a waste of life to do nothing with one's ability, for I feel that life is measured in achievement, not in years alone. Words that would still push his team forward to this very day. Seeing as he was doing pretty good on his business by going at it alone, he decided to expand his workforce, and by the end of the year, he hired more Kiwis and moved to a shed in England to try and help his racing team rise to the top. 1966 would prove to be one of the busiest and most exciting years of his career, and who better to tell you about it than our friend Josh.
Now happily married, and with a newly born daughter, McLaren and his team now needed money. One of Bruce's methods to secure that paper was to work for Ford's GT40 projects over in the United States. Now, with a bit of money behind him, McLaren moved to a bigger garage and began sketching out plans for the M1, which he would use to race in North America. One of the other perks of being Ford's test driver was a seat at Le Mans, driving alongside fellow countryman Chris Amon. And these two cats will be involved in one of the most controversial finishes in all of Le Mans history. Not that it mattered much to them because hey, they won the event. This obviously served as a big PR boost to them and allowed McLaren to further chase his ambitions. McLaren had two championships in mind, Can-Am and Formula 1, the former of which was a North American-based sports car championship which attracted an all-star lineup of drivers. Although Bruce's ambitions lay beyond just the drivers' championship, he also wanted to win in his own cars. Teddy Mayer stepped in to help out McLaren, whose leg was getting progressively worse. The 66 Can-Am season saw McLaren & Co come up short, despite there being 13 McLaren cars on the grid, although greener pastures were just on the horizon. Meanwhile, back in Europe, work was underway for McLaren to debut as a constructor. They had drafted in a designer who had worked on the Concorde to build their first Formula 1 car, the M2B. Although it wouldn't go totally according to plan, as the Ford V8 engine that they stuck in the back of it was slow enough to render it immobile, although the team would achieve its first points finishes at Watkins Glen, 3 laps behind eventual winner Jim Clark. But you should always expect teething problems at the start of any constructor's journey. McLaren certainly had theirs, but 1967 would bring on a whole different set of results.
For 1967, he entered Can-Am once again with the M6A in a season they dominated all the way through. And that was the year Bruce shows his motorsport prowess, more than ever for the motorsport race. After a brilliant qualifying, McLaren missed the formation lap due to a mechanical issue and looked unlikely to start the race. But after swift repairs were made, he went out as soon as he could, a lap behind and with it all to do. In the following laps, not only did he unlap himself, but he made up 5 places in 5 laps, and took the karting line as a way to move up to 3rd. Right after that, he'd battle for 2nd with Gurney, got ahead, and Holm went wide in 1st position. The front left tire was locked due to broken bodywork. Somehow Holm won the race, but Bruce was a close 2nd. Against all odds, it ended up being a McLaren 1-2. Bruce won the Can-Am Championship that year, with Denny Holm taking the F1 title with the Brabham team. For the 1968 F1 season, the duo raced for McLaren, an all-Kiwi lineup on board the beautiful McLaren M7A. After a rocky start due to the all-too-common unreliability issues of the old days, Spa was looking good for Holm, as he was leading the race until the drive shaft got so f***ing hot, it melted the gearbox on lap 18 and forced him to retire. This led Jackie Stewart to take the lead, but from behind, Bruce was gaining, and fast. 5th, then 4th. Then all the way up to 2nd behind Stewart. The Flying Scot would run out of fuel on the final lap, although unbeknownst to McLaren. He crossed the line and was pretty bummed, until someone came and told him he had actually won the race. This was the first win for the McLaren team, and for Bruce himself inside the car. That year was absolute madness for the team, as they would fly to Can-Am on Thursday, race on Sundays, and then fly back to the UK. The fact that there were only a dozen events in the F1 calendar certainly helped, but if there wasn't enough on their hands already, he started planning on building a road car, a GT car, so he got a scrap-tool project and made it road legal. The McLaren M6 GT was then born and was Bruce's personal car. He would take it to joyrides and to special events, if he had the time to do so, that is, seeing as he was busy enough developing the first high downforce car, the M8B, with the high wings for the 1969 Can-Am season. The car was an absolute beast and dominated the series, taking 11 out of 11 wins, and gave birth to the now reborn McLaren Gulf partnership. Just to put you in context, there were 50 mad lads in a shed in the UK, building F1 cars for January, Can-Am cars for June, and on top of that, they entered the Indy 500. The McLaren M8D Holm used for the Indy 500 in 1970 had a heavy crash and caught fire on practice. Due to it being a methanol fire, the flames were pretty much invisible to the naked eye under the sunlight. Therefore, the track marshals took long to put him out, and he got burned badly on both hands. He wouldn't be able to race that year. Also coming up were some Can-Am on F1 tests at the Goodwood circuit, that was undergoing some slight infrastructure renovation, but due to the injuries, Bruce McLaren had to do all the testing. He would go back and forth between the F1 and Can-Am cars, the latter of which was testing out a new aerodynamic concept due to the recent ban of high wings under safety concerns. When it was lunchtime, Bruce insisted on going out once more and testing out one final configuration. After a bit of pushback from the team, they agreed and set him up to go on another run. A few minutes later, on the opposite side of the circuit, he had a rear wing failure, which caused the rear of the car to lift instead of being sucked down. He lost control and crashed into one of the Marshall posts due for demolition. He fortunately passed away immediately. After the tragedy, the car was lifted up and driven back to the factory. His wife Patty found out shortly after with a visit from the guys. She had to deliver the news to Bruce's parents later that day. Curiously, his mother had had a premonition earlier that day. I guess that's just that mother and son bond you can never quite explain. The next day, the factory was closed and everyone was allowed to stay home. When they asked Patty what they should do, she thought about what her husband would say and wrote a letter to her boys. The team would carry on. After Bruce's funeral in New Zealand, Teddy Mayer took over the control of the team. Denny Hulme continued racing with Dan Gurney and Peter Gathing partnering him. The next race was going to be Motorsport on Can-Am, and against all medical advice, Hulme drove with bandaged hands for Bruce. In what can be considered as pure motorsport poetry, he came third with Gurney taking the win. The team just had to move on because that's what Bruce would have wanted. That year they won the Can-Am Championship. In 1972, the McLaren M16 chassis won at Indianapolis. In 1974, they take their first championship with Fittipaldi and another win at the Indy 500. For 1976, James Hunt would take it to the wire against Niki Lauda's Ferrari to take another championship, and that year another Indy 500 win. 10 more championships would follow with names like Lauda, Prost, Senna, Hakkinen and Hamilton, all proudly driving McLaren cars across the years to become the second oldest and third most successful team in Formula 1 history. McLaren would also expand into the roadcar business with a one-off in 1992, which is still considered one of the best cars ever made, and a comeback in 2011 that would start simple with the MP4-12C and would evolve into the P1, the Senna, the Speedtail, and many more to come, to solidify themselves as one of the best sports car makers worldwide in less than a decade. All of this is what Bruce left us, and this year we remember 50 years of his passing, not with sadness for what he may have achieved, but with respect for the mark he left, his spirit still inspiring thousands of family members, workers, fans and drivers worldwide. Alright, this has been another video, and one I think I should have made a long time ago. Once again, thank you Josh for giving me a hand with this, I really appreciate it bro. Anyways, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, click one of these videos to the right or to the left, and as always, I will see you next time.